Hello everyone, and welcome to our event, Fire in High-Rise Residential. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you to our panel, both for their interviews they had ahead of time, as well as coming and join us today to answer everyone's questions. If you do have any questions, please do use the Slido link, or the, sorry, 1 second, we had a bit of an echo there. So yeah, if we join the, use the Slido link on the ResiBuild page, or please do use the Q&A section on Zoom. I will be keeping an eye on that, and we'll try to ask as many questions to the panel as possible. If we don't get to answer all of the questions, then we will put those to the panel after the event, and hopefully they'll be able to give us some answers, and we will put that on the website for you to view their responses. So I'd like to start off by introducing our panel. So today we have Nick Horton here with myself from Sapphire Balconies, and he's Head of Marketing UK and Global. We have Howard Pacey from the FPA. Thank you, Howard, for joining us today. We have Luke Bedford from MyDeck. Also joining us is John Newman from RSP Fire Sprinkler Systems, and Archie Chandler from FCS. We also have Andrea White and Carlson Elkson from Certis, Tom Welland from BB7, and Craig Wells from Quailfire. So again, thank you very much for joining us today. And we will now be going on to our questions. I'd just like to start with Nick. Obviously, Nick, you did all the interviews for us. Did you find that there was any key themes that were raised during the interviews?
Yeah, so interesting question. There's certainly a few observations from interviewing you on, and interestingly, Regulation 38 came up in more than half the interview, so obviously quite a topical one. The other one which came up a lot was early engagement and getting people to work together as seeing the holistic picture and getting the balance there. And then the third part which came up quite a bit as well was that whole question of competency, and also in particular, I think it was Andrew and Craig, in your two interviews, there was a piece around knowing your limits as well in terms of the early engagement.
Thank you, Nick. I think we have quite a few questions that have come in from those that have viewed the pre-recorded interviews on those kind of subjects. So I'd just like to start with Archie. Like I said, mentioned, Nick, about the Regulation 38. The question was, Archie, you mentioned Regulation 38 in your interview. How does it assist to maintain a golden thread of information?
Well, the information for for Regulation 38 has been there for quite a long time. The difference with that is it's not always handed over, well, very rarely handed over, and very rarely handed over before occupation, whereas with the golden thread, it will be required to be in place before occupation. It'll be much of the same information, but it won't. Regulation 38 didn't deal with a lot of the historic information about how things were arrived at. Now, when we get the gateway system, which is already starting to be used, that information will carry on through right into occupation and the life cycle of the building. So it'll be kept, whereas a lot of the Regulation 38 information may be handed over, but when the building changes hands, invariably that information is not there. It's very, very lax at the moment. There's been a lot of companies springing up that have started gathering information electronically, which will be very good for the golden thread, but it's still very patchy.
Thank you very much, Archie. Did we have anyone else that wanted to add to that one about the Regulation 38?
I was just going to add, thank you. I was just going to add to what Archie was saying. I think that my experience is that, as you quite rightly said, that the information's either not handed over or the information isn't complete. And I think sometimes the information that is handed over is also, to to a certain extent unusable. It's a series of plans and O&M manuals and various other documents, but there's no consistency in the approach. There's no explanation. It's really just a series of drawings and documents which I think which the contractors have provided under the Regulation 38, but doesn't necessarily provide the kind of detail and information without a huge amount of work for the building owner or the building occupier. And I think that hopefully the new approach to the golden thread and the various gateways and the information that must be provided at each of those stages, we will start to see information provided in a format that can be used. I do have some concerns about the use of BIM modelling because the government's clearly keen for that to be the mechanism by which much of this information gets passed across. I think BIM is great. I do wonder about the end user of that information being able to access it and understand what they've got, but something that probably needs ironing out in the wash.
Thank you very much, Howard. Andrew, did you want to add to that one?
Yeah, I mean, I would just echo what Howard and Archie have said. In my experience, when you go to site, you end up with one of two scenarios, and one is the person that you're meeting says, "I've got nothing," and the other one will show you literally a wall of shelves covered in files, which will, they'll say to you, "It's definitely here. It's in there somewhere." But the files aren't labelled, they have no idea where this information is. And it's like looking for a needle in a haystack. So, it would be an incredibly good day if someone could actually give me something like a fire strategy that is as built. I would be astounded if I came across that more than, a couple of times a year. It's a very... At the moment, although we've got Reg 38 and we've had it for a long time, and it was Reg 16B even before that, that doesn't mean to say that we've been doing it. And my concern is that, is this golden thread Reg 38 in a different guise? And actually, is it going to change anything? At the end of the day, that's the information that I want. I want some documentation that I can look at if I'm doing, say, a fire risk assessment that actually reflects the building that I'm standing in, not a building, that was designed pre-construction, but actually it gives me some paperwork that actually looks like the building that I'm in.
Yeah. Thank you, Andrew. Archie, did you want to add to that? Sorry.
Yeah, just about, I hope it doesn't hold up the process of the building being handed over for occupation, because that's when things go wrong. If you're all trying to rush to get a building occupied, because time's money with these buildings, when if they have to sell flats or let them, so there's be a lot of pressure to get that out, and that's exactly what will happen. There'll be like the Regulation 38 if we're not careful.
Thank you. Tom, did you want to add to that one? Sorry.
Sorry, did you say me then, John? Yeah. Andrea mentioned fire strategy. This is one of the biggest issues we seem to have when we're putting together a specification for a job. All too often, the fire strategy that I have was done at quite an early stage, often by the architects, and has not been updated in line with the final plans. And the problem we have with that is sometimes we'll start a project and maybe the fire alarm strategy hasn't been determined. So then we're either having to suddenly introduce particular zone valves, flow switches, a whole variety of things. And that's how things can get lost as well and could cause big problems at the end,
Well, thank you. Tom?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that point. I mean, I echo the other panelists' sort of comments on that and the importance of that, and not just the importance for today, but in terms of 5 years' time, that information will be pertinent. I think what's interesting is we've developed as an industry, so we have more tools at our disposal. So hopefully you won't in the future have these big dusty shelves full of files that someone has to dig through. We can utilize digital tools to help. but it is critical, you know, that we have this information readily available and to be able to be interpreted and understood, and actually the information is relevant to what you're seeing in front of you. It comes back to, I guess, a big theme of competence.
That's great, thank you, Tom. We've actually had another question come in, reference Golden Thread. Is there any trials or intent of how this will be recorded from stage 0? Nick, did you want to start with that one?
Yeah, then just the conversation is interesting for those who are perhaps watching and may not know what Regulation 38 is. It's the obligation of collecting information and handing it over properly. In a nutshell, I'm sure some of the other panelists will be able to define it a lot better than that. It's not a new requirement, as we've said, but as part of the trials and into the Golden Thread in the early stages, I'm certainly aware of several different entities which have approached us. BIM for Housing is one of the ones which we're working with on the fire work stream they've got there. But there are several different people taking different approaches. Some of it sponsored by the MHCLG. It's good to see it happening, and there's certainly a few case studies being tested with some housing associations as well. So the answer is yes, there is some trials happening at those early stages. There's many people, probably including some of this panel, which are involved in those conversations as well.
Thank you, Nick. Did anyone else have any information there about any trials that they're involved with for the Golden Thread? Archie?
Yeah, I mean, Gateway 1's being used in London now, and you're required under London Plan to submit a fire statement now for planning. And at that stage, they want all the information for Gateway 1. So it's already being in one area of the country. We're already being asked for fire statements because in August, Town and Country Planning Act will require a fire statement. So we're already being asked for those. And invariably what's happening now is a project is way down the line and they're suddenly asking for a fire statement from a competent fire engineer for a project you've never been involved in because the architect's been doing it, but they can't get it through planning without it. So this is going to happen, and probably companies are going to find a bit of a deluge towards the end of August because people can't get their planning permission. So this is already happening for Gateway 1. Across the country it will happen. So for residentials. So beware. So London is particularly more onerous in the statement because that's been decided by the mayor. The others have got the Town and Country Planning Act, which is a preset form, and it's not particularly onerous, but in London it is. So beware.
Thank you, Archie. We do actually have an audience member that's put their hand up, so I believe you might have a question. Alan, I'm just going to allow you to talk. Did you have a question for the panel?
No, I pressed that by accident, so I apologise for that.
All right, no worries, thank you. Okay, so moving on to our next question. Obviously, a few of you people have mentioned competency. Andrea, how can we address the competency issue regarding the skills gap?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And for me, working in the industry, it's probably the most important question at the moment. I started in the industry just over 20 years ago, and I caught the tail end of you know, the fire service college, you know, being the fire service college before it was privatized, and I've watched the standards of training, and you know, if I'm honest, I've seen them diminish, and I've got some real concerns. There's a psychologist in Canada called Jordan B. Peterson, and he does YouTube videos of some of his lectures. And one of the things he says is that if you want to teach, you need to know 10 times more than what you're teaching. And I can see what he means by that. You know, you can't only know the slides that you're putting up to teach from. You have to know so much more in order to be able to teach the people that are in front of you. And I'm not sure that that's quite what we're doing at the moment. I've made it a little bit of a mission to go and attend some, various fire safety courses. And yeah, I've been quite disappointed, if I'm honest. It's actually quite hard to find good quality training, and it's very much down to the individual instructors. And once you find a good one, it's not dictated by price. If you find a good one, then it's quite unusual, and I'm very keen to sort of disseminate that knowledge that this is a good instructor. But my experience is that we really need to look at the competency of the people who are offering to increase the knowledge of people in our industry.
Yes, thank you, Andrea. Carson, would you have anything to add? I know that you do a lot of training courses. How are you finding, like say, the competency across the board?
It's a very interesting topic. It's sometimes, I don't know, I don't mean to sound patronizing when I say this. Sometimes it's scary what people don't know when it's supposed to be their job. For example, in the fire engineering world, I'm quite often teaching people things that they should be well aware of, which is concerning because I wonder how that lack of knowledge got there in the first place. I'd more expect that any training we're delivering for those kind of level people to be more of a brushing up, if you like. But on the whole, what I really am enthused about is that I kind of got a bit of a feeling before COVID, especially, that there was a lot of people who would just, all they were interested in when they're coming along to sessions to learn things was the food and, maybe to get away from their desks for an hour or so. But now it really seems to have changed. Actually, people there's this hunger to learn, and especially in the fire safety industry, people are starting to take the learning and the knowledge of it really seriously. And that's a really rewarding thing to be part of. I'm sure I'll be interested in Craig's comments on that, because I know he does a lot of education around this sort of thing as well.
Thank you, Carson. Yeah, Craig, I was going to bring to you as well. So you do a lot of courses. How are you finding it?
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, no, I definitely would echo that. That there certainly seems to be that extra, or you've used the word hunger, I was going to say thirst, for learning and embracing. You might say investing the time, whereas going to a CPD at lunchtime had perhaps been a bit of a box ticking exercise and a bit of a chore for some. But we are seeing it, I think, referred to it in the interview, even perhaps you might say unlikely industries actually reaching out to us proactively and wanting to learn more. Perhaps parallel industries, which is really good. I guess maybe it's a combination of things. There's obviously all that's going on in the fire safety world, but perhaps even the effects of COVID has actually woken a few people up to the fact that we do have access to training and extra resource that we can embrace digitally, some cases in our own time. So yeah, I definitely echo that message. Really, there is a desire, and I think we as manufacturers for sure have got to harness our knowledge and ability to convey that to the relevant parties.
Thank you, Craig. John, I believe you put your hand up.
Yeah, this is a big subject for us at the moment, particularly in our industry. There are kind of two levels of competence I think you need to look at. One is third-party certification. I think that's a must. But then you have the situation where you've got obviously the employees within that company, and because of the demand, there are a lot of companies now, people coming through and getting their third-party certification. But I am finding, simply by talking to them sometimes, that they're not really looking at other issues. One particular one is an example. We use CPVC pipe and fittings, and there's some critical factors with that, and really everyone should have CPVC training from the providers of the equipment, or the manufacturers, and it's worth checking the certificates. Simple little things. It's a solvent weld process of putting these items together, and if you introduce test water too quickly, it stops the chemical process. So the pipe and the fitting hasn't welded together. It's surprising how many people I've spoken to who didn't realize this, and they'll finish an installation because they want to get home. They immediately fill the system with water. So then you've got a system that could potentially blow apart. That's just one instance, but there's quite a lot of things in the background that we have to demonstrate competency of our workforce. And I don't see it as just the sharp end installation engineers either. The way I look at it now is everybody within the organization has to be suitably trained and competent for their role. There could be a person, I don't know, maybe procurement or whatever, who's not fully trained, might order a part that's not suitable for purpose. Looks right. The installation engineer may not realize it. That part fails. Where do you stand? So I think every single person in an organization has to be suitably trained for the role that they perform.
Yeah, thank you, John. We have had a comment come in here. It's alongside one of the questions that we had. Too many individuals think they're competent due to the number of years spent in industry and obtained registering with certain bodies via grandfather rights. We'll be interested to know how this issue can be tackled in organisations where lack of understanding, you find yourself banging against a brick wall. We also had a kind of question about the aspect of attendance only kind of courses. So because you've attended the course, you're qualified. With going forward, obviously the responsible person's been mentioned before when it comes to the buildings. So how do we make sure that these responsible people are actually qualified and competent in their role, as opposed to attending attendance recognised courses? Andrew, I know that you mentioned about that. Did you want to start with that one?
Well, I don't see that a responsible person needs to have any particular competencies. So the RP could be the employer, and in most cases probably will be the employer as a body corporate. So, I think what we're talking about is competency of competent persons, as they're defined in the fire safety order. So, if we're looking at that competency of the competent person or persons, I don't mind how they become competent, but in general, what I see is that people are operating at a particular level without necessarily having the levels of skill, knowledge, background, experience, understanding, all of those great things that we define competency as. And the other point I will make is that when I did my health and safety studying a long time ago, the definition of competence that I learned had a second part to it. So it said, competence is skills, knowledge, understanding, experience, and all of that. But that individual also knows the limits of their competence. And that's disappeared. I've looked on the HSE website, everywhere I've looked, it's gone. And actually knowing the limitations of your competence, for me, is almost the more important issue than being competent. I assess, I review for the fire risk register for the IFE, and I read fire risk assessments for care homes and special needs premises, and the level of competence that you need to be able to risk assess a building of that occupancy, a high risk building, is high. And these individuals clearly don't understand that. I would say that they're not at that level of competence. They haven't appreciated the limitations of their competence. So for me, it's more about, do people realise what they don't know and where to stop?
Thank you, Andrea. Howard, did you want to add to that one?
Sorry, trouble unmuting myself. I think the competence issue is huge, and I think, as Andrea said rightly at the start, it's one of the the biggest issues facing the industry at the moment. And I think it's really difficult to see the wood for the trees sometimes. You know, John made reference to third-party certification, and clearly that's a primary route to ensuring that if you're employing an installer or you're choosing to use a particular product, that you're choosing something that has had that third-party verification check. So that brings a degree of comfort. But when it comes to looking at certain other roles within the fire industry, and you know, we could look at fire risk assessors initially as one example, and Andrea made reference to the IFE's register and the peer review work that she does, and they have an approach to looking at competency which involves background knowledge and understanding, effective training, experience, use of an appropriate template for doing the fire risk assessment. So there's a I suppose a 4-step approach in looking at individuals. I know that some of the other registers, such as that run by Warrington Fire, their FRAC scheme, they actually go out, they interview people, they go out on site and witness individuals doing their fire risk assessments. So the same as the BAFE SP 205 scheme for fire risk assessors requires. So you have to have a witnessed inspection, and it's bringing that level of, I suppose, assurance and that level of peer review to an individual or to an organisation that provides that level of robustness, I think, that ensures the individual does have a baseline competence. But then at the same time, Andrew's also made the point, as has John, with regard to, well, how do you assess that somebody is competent to undertake work in a higher risk environment? Because if I'm competent, for example, to undertake a fire risk assessment in an office or in a storage warehouse, doesn't necessarily mean I'd be competent to undertake a fire risk assessment on a construction site, in a residential care home, or in a hospital. Because the risks are significantly different, and in some circumstances the rules are also slightly different. So I think that it's a difficult call for individuals who are looking to appoint a fire risk assessor to make sure they've got the right person. Now, going to somebody on a register has got to be the best place to start. Somebody's on the register, somebody else has had a look at them, somebody else has reviewed their work, and the likelihood is that they have a good understanding of fire safety. But then for that responsible person who's looking to appoint specialist consultants, a fire risk assessor to support them, or maybe like we do here, and we mentioned fire strategies earlier, writing retrospective fire strategies for buildings, they need to assure themselves not only that the individual is competent, but that they also have experience of the type of premises they're being asked to work on and the type of project they're being asked to undertake. Because without that level of check, I suppose, you can't be sure that somebody who proclaims their competence or is even on a register necessarily has the skill set and the experience to be able to undertake something of a more high risk nature. And then I suppose there's also the issue of insurance. Do they have appropriate professional indemnity and professional liability insurance? And so within this is a really long answer, but within the fire risk assessor sector, there is quite a robust approach. But we're now also seeing I think they're called the Building Safety Alliance has been established, looking at the setting up registers for the building safety manager, which is another key role within this new firmament that we see ourselves moving into. And they're working hard as a group of organisations to bring some consistency to it, but they're almost starting from nowhere. They're starting from the ground up, and there's often an awful lot of work for them to do, I think, to be able to establish what competency looks like in that role, and how they're going to effectively bring the right people together, develop the right competency frameworks, and then go through the process of proving people's competency. And that doesn't get away from the issue you mentioned earlier with regard to grandfather rights, and how do we deal with those individuals who've been in the job for donkey's years and think they have the experience to tackle just about everything. And I think that again comes down to the third-party certification element, because I know for those of us in the room who are members of a professional organisation like the Institution of Fire Engineers, Institute of Fire Safety Managers, just for 2 examples, there is a specific requirement on us to undertake CPD, to log that CPD, and to be able to prove that we're doing CPD. And I suppose that, you know, that brings a further degree of rigour to the process.
Great, thank you, Howard. Nick, did you want to add to that one?
Yeah, I was thinking, I completely agree with you, Howard, and the whole essence of competency is addressing a lot of the challenges we've seen coming out in the tragic Grenfell inquiry and so on. But there are a couple of things I think are quite relevant. I think the competency piece is struggling with the same bit in a way that the product testing is as well. And Luke, you probably find exactly this as well, but it's easy enough for a car, for instance, to have a MOT program, and there's a register of all the people approved and so on. But there's certain parameters which all of those fit into. And the challenge you get is when you get more niche applications, balconies are certainly one of those. And we've seen it for years with CSCS cards. And remember when they pulled the CRO card, 5, 6, 7 years ago now, they recommended that balcony installers undertook a course in carpentry to get a card relevant to it, but this is not an element of timber in a balcony. And I think that's where the testing sits as well, really. We're finding it is that there's not a test standard for balconies, and I guess that's the same, perhaps, Luke, with your decking systems and so on. But it is a challenge where you've got these niche items. How do you actually draw them into the same scheme without it being diluted, like we saw with the CSCS cards previously, where basically anyone could go for a visitor card or something like that, which is very, very generic. Interested to know what others have found on that.
I think it's I think it's an issue not necessarily for balconies have been around for a long time. Let us face it, but clearly they've been drawn into the spotlight somewhat because of the potential impacts that have been identified, or the impacts that they may have on external fire spread. But I think the same issue exists right across the industry, talking about a very, very different subject, but cleaning of kitchen extract ductwork. We've moved on from sort of shoving small boys down ductwork and getting them to clean on the inside, and people are actually doing it from the outside. But there are new technologies being developed in cleaning products and cleaning materials. But we've recently, or over the last few years, been engaged with an organisation or contact with an organisation who spray bugs into ductwork, very much like the some of those probiotic yogurts that you get to make you feel healthier. And these bugs eat the fat, they die, and they turn to dust and they blow away. And they've done some really successful trials, and it seemed to work really, really well. But at the same time, there's no certification scheme for those kinds of products. And so, those who have some influence in the market, whether that be fire and rescue services, whether it be us fire consultants, whether it be insurers, are unwilling, I suppose, to recommend a certain approach or a certain way of doing things, unless there is some form of certification that backs it up. And so I think in terms of the issue associated with balconies and the competence associated with them, I think you're in a similar boat to so many other parts of the sector that are developing new technologies, but at that time there's no certification scheme for them to work to, sadly.
Yeah, and agree, and it's like your example there. There's also the issues we've had around laminate glass and the inadvertently being banned, and you get a new product to the market. What's it tested to? What's the competency of people which are actually going around and speaking to people? Because there are some of those which are fitting within kind of certain exemptions and so on. But it's quite easy to, with many of these new products, to perhaps fall back into the trap of actually having something which is tested, something you can't really use it in an application because it's not a direct test standard. But I appreciate we're drawing away from your initial question there, Kelly, but I'd be quite keen to know what Luke finds on this.
Yeah, so Luke, would you like to add to that one?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and it's fascinating what's coming in. I guess we're asked a lot for training as a manufacturer. I actually think we have a large responsibility for training. We've got approved installers with our products, and we're often asked by installers, what certifications do we need to have a training schedule, or what do we need? And I think there's a hunger out there for more knowledge and for people to attain to the standard and get a sense that they are adhering to the standard and they're going above and beyond. I think there's a real hunger, as was referred to earlier. And I think also the training which is coming has been very interesting around the CPDs. We obviously hold a huge amount of CPDs, even more now since COVID with Zoom and Teams. We're doing a lot remotely and we can reach more people around the country. But I wonder whether we need to go a step further as manufacturers and almost do CPDs to those going through school or universities or going for diplomas, so we can actually teach people from the ground root. So when they do start their job, they've had real case studies, real life experiences, almost to just help them get ahead of themselves. I don't know if that helps at all. But
yes, thank you, Luke. John, did you want to add to this one? Sorry, John's muted there. Good. Archie, sorry, yes, you can go.
Yeah, just bringing it back to competency really is that one of my concerns is the competency of the fire authorities now, and the new health and safety regulation team. They're going to recruit 1,200 people for this, and my fear is that they're going to recruit the wrong people with the wrong competencies, without any real knowledge about on the ground working. That's my fear, because I know I was in the fire brigade for 35 years, and the knowledge of construction of buildings is very, very limited. Fire brigades never go out to a site. They're told not to, because they don't want to be involved and be seen to have agreed something. So their knowledge is very, very scant. Yet they're the approvers. Well, no, they're not the approvers, that they are the authority that are supposed to be the policing authority for this. And similarly, the health and safety executive will be the same. And that's my concern, is they won't really have experience and knowledge firsthand. They may have degrees and qualifications, but that does not make you knowledgeable about the industry.
Thank you, Archie. Carlson, you want to add something to that one?
Yes, I fully agree with Archie's point. We will say we're doing a huge amount of training in fire and rescue services up and down the country in relation to smoke control, because they have hugely limited knowledge of it at the moment. Yeah. But they're absolutely fascinated to learn, and there's a huge willingness to learn more about it. But I do wonder if that's really coming from us as a proactive thing. What I'm surprised or intrigued about is why it's not being actually fed down from the fire and rescue services, approaching people like us saying, can we have this training, or this training is mandated. And the same thing applies to building control, for example. We find building control signing off things that are very definitely suspect, and it says in the standards that you shouldn't do it, and you still find it being signed off. And until building control say, no, I'm not going to sign that off, and you're going to have to change that unit, then we're not going to get people complying, because they know we can still get it through because building control sign it off. So surely there needs to be some sort of training for those people approving things as well. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, thank you, Carson. Tom, did you want to add to that one?
Yeah, thank you. Some good comments already. I mean, I guess the thing to reinforce is that competence isn't finishing line. People should never really stop learning. The legislation evolves, building evolves, design evolves. I think it's important that everyone has a responsibility. So it's great, actually, lots of manufacturers are giving back and giving valuable time to help upskill others in industry. I think also organisations have a duty to mentor people right the way through, the very first day at a company until they retire or leave the company. I think we need to have a clear sort of learning and development pathway. There was a comment in the chat about the gas safe register. So I've been on the Fire Industry Association's Risk Assessment Council since day one, and that's obviously been mentioned. It's been effectively shot down. We won't have a register like gas safe register for risk assessors. It's very unlikely to happen in the near future, which would have been a nice standpoint for consumers to go, yes, that's absolutely the right person. But we do have personal records or registers with the IFE, IFSM. You also have organisational ones, such as mentioned earlier. But I think it's important that consumers understand to not just approach an organisation and say, well, this organisation is carrying out the work. It's which engineer, which consultant, can I speak to them? And sort of echo, I think, Howard's points earlier that, you know, just because you've been in the industry for an awful long time, you may have specialised in commercial space and nothing to do with residential. But I think by having the conversation with people and the actual person that you are commissioning to do work for you, they should be quite happy to have that conversation. And I think it was mentioned earlier is about protection, to make sure they're actually insured to do that type of work.
That's great, thank you. We have had a comment here as well. Hi, would the competency issue understanding your limits of knowledge be resolved if proper accountability is introduced, like the oil and gas industry? Due to the associated risk and consequences of being held accountable, individuals are better placed to say no and not sign off on decisions without checking. Tom, did you want to lead with that one?
It's a difficult situation we're in, really. I think it's difficult for organisations and consumers and buildings to gather all this information, understand who's doing the work for them. But I think everyone's got a responsibility to solve a lot of these issues, and a lot of the issues that we're talking about revolve around the same thing. A lot of it is information, is competence of the people, and the evolving of standards and the environment around them. But I don't think, you know, we're going to get to one clean sweep of this is the solution, this is the answer. You know, there's a lot of people that need to take responsibilities for these things.
Thank you. Archie, did you want to add to that one?
Yeah, I think it is a large industry, the construction industry, and the competency of every single person is a very big ask to be able to control. I just don't know how it's going to work. I go to sites all the time, and the volume of people going through those sites is amazing, with different trades from different places all across Europe come into the UK to do things. So it's very difficult to ensure that everybody is competent. You know, I think it's a big ask. It's what we want to do, but I just feel it is a big ask.
Thank you, Archie. Howard, do you want to add to that one?
Yeah, I think this issue of accountability and responsibility is really complex, and I'm still not sure that people really understand that responsible person role, or the accountable nature of the accountability that different roles carry. So, just for example, Andrew was talking earlier about the responsible person being the body corporate, or the board of trustees, the board of directors, whoever it might be. But reading through the regulatory reform fire safety order and the similar legislation in Scotland and Northern Ireland, that responsibility is passed down. So anybody who has, I think it says something like anybody who to any extent has responsibility for any aspect of safety of the building can also be held accountable. So I think that issue of accountability is addressed. It's just not understood, and it's interesting to note that the Building Safety Bill does introduce this, I suppose this idea of an accountable person. So I think that we are moving in the right direction in terms of being able to define better who is responsible for what and who carries responsibility for what. And if you look at some of the prosecutions, for example, you might find that a fire risk assessor is prosecuted for producing a poor fire risk assessor. The responsible person, i.e. the building owner or occupier, is prosecuted for not having a suitable and sufficient fire risk assessor. But then subsequently, the fire alarm and detection system installer or maintainer is also prosecuted for not maintaining their system effectively. So there is that tiered approach. I think that the thing that concerns me the most, and something we've not really touched on, and maybe we don't want to, is just the potential for a two-tier system to develop, really, because we're putting so much effort into ensuring the competency of individuals involved in high-rise, high-risk buildings. But what about the rest of the built estate? You know, why aren't we dealing with that at the same time? And maybe it is, one bite of the cherry at a time. And rather than trying to tackle all ills at once, we do it in bits and pieces. And it's certainly the case with the the Fire Precautions Act, for those of us who are old enough to remember it. There's a few on the screen here with receding hairlines. I think we're probably in the same boat as me. But when they introduced the Fire Precautions Act, they then started designating buildings to fall under that piece of legislation. First were hotels and boarding houses, then there were factories, offices, shops and railway premises, etc. And it may well be we see an approach like that, but I think we're moving in the right direction. We just need to avoid, I suppose, a two-tiered approach where we're dealing just with high rise and high risk on one hand, and then everything else falls under the radar.
Interesting you mentioned that, Howard. We did have a question early on saying we all refer to 11 metres to 18 metres. Do we not believe this will become to all buildings of all uses as per note in Part B? I don't know if you want to carry on leading with that one.
I suppose my opinion on this is that we're missing a trick slightly. I think that heard lots of people talk around this issue of height and how we came up with 18 metres, and was it to do with the reach of a firefighting ladder, or how much water they could pump to a certain height at a certain rate to be able to extinguish a fire or tackle a fire. And I think that we're seeing a step towards the right approach in dealing with high rise and then looking at other higher risk type premises, because I think the argument should be, or the decisions we're making should be based on risk and vulnerability of occupants, not necessarily on the height of the building. Because what difference does that make? Yes, it makes it more difficult to get people out potentially, particularly if you've got a high-rise block of flats with a single staircase. But at the same time, you might have incredibly vulnerable people in a 2 or 3 story residential care home or in a hospital, and some of those some of those elements are falling outside of this new regime. So in terms of the height issue, it may well be something that is brought forward, and other parts of the built estate are brought into and under that regime. But again, I still think that we're missing a trick by focusing on height as just one facet of risk, rather than risk in its in a broader perspective.
Nick, do you want to add to that one?
Yeah, it's an interesting point to have, mates, and it comes up quite a lot. Obviously, Scotland already lowered that height from 18 metres. We also see it overseas. We particularly in Canada and New Zealand, where we work as well. They've been consulting in New Zealand to take it down to 10 metres. But as I noticed a comment on the chat, and it does sum up quite well, I think, is that actually there are a lot of people which are taking it seriously and learning from those issues and the fires and the incidents which we're seeing occur. And as bad as each one is, if we're learning from it and applying it to the next project, does that make a difference whether it's 11 or 18? We would rarely find people taking a different approach now ourselves, and that's a good thing. But I think it's an obligation, all of us, to actually learn from it and not look for the caveats of, it's under whatever that height may be, or whatever the matrix is, which has been referred to by the government, of actually having a different measuring system and actually not looking for loopholes, but actually applying good learning in the best places.
I'm sorry to interject, but I think one of the lessons we're learning from Grenfell is that the system does get gamed, whichever way you play it. It does get gamed, and you'll get buildings built to a height of 17.5 metres, simply to avoid the additional requirements. And I think that, I certainly hope that people will play fair. But I suspect that over time there will still be gaming of the system. I think that having the new regulator in place, the new gateways in place, the requirements for fire statements and fire strategies will overcome some of those issues where people who are trying to game the system will be caught early doors and told to remediate. But I still think that whichever way we turn, whether we base it on height, whether we base it on a range of other risks, there will still be organisations, sadly, trying to game the system to reduce cost, improve build times, or simply provide a different product.
Thank you, Howard. Tom, did you want to add to that one?
Yeah, kind of follling on from that. I thought I'd make a comment about British standards, important documents that provide us guidance for installation, for lots of different uses, and yet they can be quite a lot of money. And we mustn't say that just because you're a large company, you're instantly more competent than a one-man band. But this information, if it's that important, it should be readily available and free. Yeah. And the font size should be a decent font size. And I think if you read through a lot of British, they're written in a lot of them are very technical terms, which you can convey technical information in more layman speak. Because ideally you might want someone that's not in that industry to pick it up and to do a double check or to understand where this is coming from. The information in the suite of standards is really critical, and yet it costs a lot of money to maintain and to keep updated. It almost seems bizarre. If this is about life safety, this really important aspect, why on earth are you charging people for that information?
It's great, thank you, Tom. I think we had a lot of nodding heads there, so I think the panel's in agreement with you. Archie, I think you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I just reiterate what Tom is saying, is that British standards are a horrendous price, and every time they're updated, you've got to get another one, and some of them are contradictory to other ones. You know, it just seems to be they write them in silos, and then you end up batting one against another. To be a fire engineering company, you need them all because you're asked about every single one. And it's for a small sort of one-man or two-man band, I should say, is very, very difficult.
Thank you, Archie. Andrew, did you want to add to that one as well?
Yeah, I mean, I would concur with Archie that, you know, without a doubt, the British standards are written in silos. I find it quite interesting also the makeup of the committees that write the British standards. Yep. You know, when we look at something like the post-war building studies, who wrote that? It was clearly a group of eminent professionals who'd been asked to come together. You know, it was your chartered surveyors, your architects, you know, your fire professionals. It made sense to me. And now, you know, you're on that committee for various reasons. You know, it's a lot of time and effort. But my concern is that, have we got that impartiality in the committee that's writing those British standards? And I'm not sure we have. And also, have we got people with a breadth of knowledge that can look further than the British standard that they're writing about and ensure that that British standard doesn't disagree with another British standard or contradict it? And for me, we haven't quite got to that point yet. I would love to see a slightly more joined up and a slightly more impartial makeup of those committees.
Yeah, I agree. Totally agree.
Thank you, everyone. Moving on slightly onto a slightly different question. I did have a comment here that was totally agree with Carlson on an earlier point you made. They are currently undertaking a large recladding scheme and have ensured that the fire service and building control have been involved in the design development process from day one. Has worked well, but there's definitely room for improvements. This kind of leads to another question that we had. Carlson, I think it'd be like really for yourselves, Craig, John, and Luke, as product suppliers kind of thing, what stage should you be brought in to the design to make sure that these buildings are fire safe? So Carlson, I don't know if you'd like to start with that one.
Yeah, as I mentioned to Nick in the interview section, it's from our point of view, especially with smoke control, people just don't realise how structural it is, and actually the strategy around the smoke control is hugely dictated by where you put shafts in the building, where you put staircases, etc. And so if we're being brought in in unfortunate circumstances, we may be brought in at, say, stage 5, for example, when all of those things have been built, it's very, very difficult to actually come up with or if there are problems with the strategy, to rectify those, and it ends up being doing the best job you can situation. Whereas if we're brought in just for comment, for example, at stage 2, and we can look at those early stage plans and make some initial recommendations, I think that would really help. And also, it's important that people will understand that by doing so, they're not tying themselves down to a manufacturer, for example. As long as the understanding is there from everyone, that, you know, this job will go to tender, it will go out to the market, etc., and that no one's being led to believe something else. We as manufacturers are very happy to look at those early stage plans and say, you might want to just check, say, 991, 999 to make sure that what you're proposing is actually correct there, because it looks a bit suspect. And at those early stages, we can provide hopefully valuable advice that will save an awful lot of time and money down the line without any commercial obligations.
Great, thank you, Carson. Luke, did you want to add to that one?
I fully back up what Carson said. It's critical to have an early engagement as possible, is what we're finding, especially with a lot of the obviously the move away or change in legislations, especially around non-combustible facades. The earlier engagement you can get, the less time and the more clarity around the process. Even with the refurbishment, there's some people sitting on the fence when it comes to a project which may be on the fence. Do they go above and beyond, or do they just comply at the time? The earlier engagement, the better. I'd back up what Carson says on that.
Thank you, Luke. John, did you want to add to that one? How early would you say that you would need to be brought in? I know that you mentioned obviously something on your interview about a lot of people not understanding what water supply you needed. So with all of those kind of aspects, when should you be brought in?
It is at that first draft, pretty much the same as what Carson has said, really. It's at that first draft stage where they've got what they feel is the layout for construction. The sort of issues we do have is that the plant room may not be big enough. They may have provided a plant room for us that we don't actually need if you've got a domestic boosted supply. So there's space going spare there. Sometimes we find that they think we can put everything in a cupboard, you know, and you've got every other service in the cupboard as well. So there's a whole variety of things. So it's at that early stage. And I repeat as well, the fire strategy. I always need to know the latest on the fire strategy.
Great, thank you, John. Craig, did you want to add to that one?
Yeah, just to echo the points made, really. Yeah, there is kind of no stage which is too early from our perspective. The worst can happen is we'll turn around and say, well, we need more specific information. You've got to advance your design. But I suppose our challenge is we can only supply solutions that we have tested. And that testing and certification process is very, very lengthy. And of course, you know, there's expense involved as well. So we may well have to turn around and say, no, you need to go and change that pipe or change that wall or change that insulation type. So yeah, definitely before you're advancing too far. So just really.
Did you want to add?
Yeah, definitely. I was linking on with and it's no surprise that we all feel the same way about the British standards being chargeable and so on. And certainly the NHBC ones we find from a balcony context have always been referred to because they're a lot more readily available. In terms of the standards and interpretation of that, and I've seen there's a comment on the chat as well about one of the British standards there being over 1,000 pages. That's quite some read, but I think that's where it's actually really should be an obligation, all of us as manufacturers, to understand your area. But it's the bringing together of those which creates the balance, which is so important as well, because we can approach something from a balcony point of view, and we can talk about in early engagement, stage 2, stage 3. We can talk about designing out anchors, saving thermal breaks and fire pen interface and so on. But there's so many other things which come into play as well, what the material or the facade type is and what other things are going on in those areas and so on. So to get that balance, it needs a conversation not between one person and an architect, but between multiple different parties at that earlier stage. So you're getting the right amount of balance there to actually consider these things. And that's something, tragically, we've seen in the Grenfell inquiry from the thermal value being very aspirational, but with the fire consequently suffering in terms of the performance of it. But that's the kind of thing we really talk about, I think, is getting that balance at an early stage, which is so important.
That's great, thank you. We do have a question in as well saying about materials. I know, like Luke, you mentioned about different materials being used and things before. The question is mainly about if you have a standard, how do you encourage people to go for the best option? I think we've had it in an event previously where we've described it like about replacing your tyres on your car. You know, this tyre will pass the test, but it's not great, and you're probably going to have an accident in wet weather kind of thing. But this more expensive tyre is going to be much better. But why pay for the expensive one if the cheaper one will actually get you past the standard? So how do we encourage people to actually, invest more to make things safer, not just to comply with the regulations that are in place? Andrew, did you have something? Oh, I know Archie is, but Archie, sorry, did you want to lead that one then? Sorry.
Yeah, I'd just go, because I sit on lots of design teams for quite large builds, and the whole ethos of the building regs is to do the minimum. And that's right across the, no matter what you're doing, they want you to do the minimum standard that's in the building. They won't rise above it. And we often put in our fire strategies suggestions to the client to improve fire safety beyond the building regs. And it never gets done because eventually they come along with this value engineering. And that basically means they'll cut out everything that isn't a requirement under the building regs. So the building regs are the problem with the industry, because it is a minimum standard, and that's the standard they will often go to. Just recently, I've had quite a few housing providers going beyond the minimum standard. And that's directly because of Grenfell and everything else they know that's going on with the building safety bill. But it's almost like they've woken up to it in some of the residential providers. But as far as the design teams go, the ethos is the building regs are the standard, if you like, and that's the minimum you go to.
Thank you. Luke, do you want to add to that one? Luke, sorry.
Yeah. No, I echo what Archie says. That it's important. The other thing for us as manufacturers is to very clearly share the design life as well, or the design life cost. Obviously, we're a manufacturer of aluminium decking, but we're seeing some of the G15 housing associations now are looking to replace timber with aluminium, non-combustible aluminium, because it's not only increasing safety, but it's got a 60-year design life rather than 12 years of timber. And it's also easier to maintain. It doesn't get slippery, so there's less likelihood of claims. So the overall life cost of aluminium for those building providers is a lot less than timber, and it's just really sharing the knowledge and the insights. And I guess it comes back to training. The price initially isn't everything. So it helps.
Thank you, Nick. Do you want to add to that one?
Yeah, I was thinking of what Carsten touched on a little earlier about being involved at an early stage, and what is the driver for manufacturers to be involved. And ultimately it's normally about buildability, making it simpler, making it more workable and a better overall solution, and that's certainly the approach which we take for sure. If we can minimize the amount of materials in it, it's better from carbon, and better from a thermal point of view, better from a cost point of view. And this is a cost avoidance we're talking about, which actually, certainly in the case of balconies, that's the whole purpose of why we're doing it. It's about buildability and making a better overall solution. Actually, you can save yourself a lot of money in the process. It shouldn't be seen as a barrier and a way of actually having a kind of locked door situation or a frozen design when you come to the later stages of the process.
Thank you. Howard, did you want to add to that one?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, just reflecting what Archie was saying about value engineering, and I think that's been that has been a huge issue, and one which hopefully, as I mentioned earlier, the gateways will take care of, and the requirement for fire statements and fire strategies. But also reflecting on the point he made about minimum standards, and the building regulations are a minimum standard for life safety. That's all they're there to ensure. Now, I don't for a moment disagree that is by far and away the most important facet of what we do as an industry in ensuring the fire safety of a building. But at the same time, it seems to me that often a client isn't necessarily advised as well as they could be, that they do have other options they can take if they want to. Because if we're talking about, an individual simply building warehousing, for example, building a warehouse to meet minimum life safety requirements is relatively straightforward, but a single fire could take it down. and lose the stock and the entire facility because of the generally uncompartmented nature of the building. But if somebody had advised the client at the time that the design was going through, that if you do this and you do this, or potentially install a sprinkler system, provide additional protection to the steelwork, that if the event that there's a fire, your building will still be there. You might lose your stock, but we could compartment your building for you, so you only lose half of what you've got. And similarly, looking at a school environment, we appreciate the difficulties that schools have been through over the last 18 months. Students having their studies disrupted. But can you imagine the devastation of a fire in a school where students lose their coursework, they have to relocate to different schools, their studies are interfered with, the community loses an opportunity to meet in a different space and such like. And I think we're missing a trick somewhere, with this focus just on the life safety factors, and that I think those involved in the design community need to be better at advising the client of what the options are for them. And I think also just looking at some of the information in the chats and the Q&A, somebody there making a reference to how a fire engineer is commonly treated within the design team. Come in, write the strategy, answer a few questions later on, and we won't need you after that. But really, they should be involved the whole way through, because as the design changes and develops, it's important that that fire engineer continues their involvement. But the difficulty is that you will commonly have an architect or the lead of a design team who doesn't necessarily know how to instruct those individuals that are providing them with advice. So there's a huge more there to do, simply just in, I think, upskilling the client. And maybe upskilling the design team in terms of the options available to them from manufacturers, from other consultants, in providing the kind of advice that they need at that stage in order to get a safe building, and not necessarily just a life-safe building, but a building with some resilience to it.
Thank you, Howard. John, you wanted to add to that one?
Yes, one common expense that's incurred that doesn't need to be incurred relates to water supplies. Very often when I see initial specifications for high-rise or multi-story projects, they within the plans or within the mechanical side of things, they have two sets of water supplies, one for the domestic and one for the sprinklers. And they just assume having a separate sprinkler's water supply is bound to be the best option. But in fact, if you have a boosted domestic supply that's sufficient for the sprinklers as well, the relevant standard, BS 9251, actually says that taking the water from a boosted domestic supply is a more robust solution. So you're saving quite a lot of money, supposedly value engineering or whatever, but actually not compromising safety. And the reason for this is, if you have the domestic boosted supply fail, you know pretty quick, because the residents are on the phone saying, I've got no water going into my bath or whatever, into my kettle. And I've been to a high-rise project where we did an installation, and there was pumps and tanks there. And we were called out on a Monday and found out that the sprinkler pump had been faulty all weekend, and everyone was just ignoring the signal, ignoring the alarm coming from the plant room, So I think it's a very valid point, and definitely a domestic boosted system where you've also got your 3 pumps usually as well, or more, is definitely a more robust way of doing it.
Thank you, John. Andrea, you wanted to add to it as well?
Yeah, thank you. I was just going to pick up on one of the points that Howard made about communication. I've just been reviewing a fire strategy of a building that is almost finished, and I've gone back to the client and said, I don't understand why there are so many assumptions stated in here. And have you ever been asked these assumptions? Have you read this document? And can you concur that these assumptions are valid? I think there's a definite need for better communication. And I don't think it should be difficult. I think we do need to get better at communicating to work out what the client wants, what we can provide, and perhaps what other parties such as insurers are looking for, and then devise a fire strategy that meets everybody's expectations. And what I'm seeing is that that perhaps doesn't happen, we're not communicating effectively enough yet.
Thank you very much, Andrea. We do have another question that came in. So I think the problem is that clients and designers may not realise, it is this one, isn't it? Sorry. Sorry, just lost my question. The one above. There are quite a few questions coming, so sorry, bear with me on that one. How does the panel see the principal designer role evolving? I work for a large architectural practice in London who provide the PD service alongside the executive architectural role on large projects, but due to PI costs issues and having a named accountable person liable for prosecution, they are looking to pull this service. So due to this, a potential very competent PD organisation would be lost. Any thoughts on this? That's open to the panel. Is anyone that wants to lead with that one? Archie?
Yeah, I mean, the government have said they're going to do something about this insurance business, because it's just putting people, quite competent people, out of the game of doing some of the things. And it's wrong. It just is bad for the industry. Now, the government said they're going to do it, but that doesn't mean to say it's going to happen. Insurance industry have hiked up PI or won't provide it. And they won't provide it for a lot of architects now doing any sort of design work for fire. It's endemic in even building controls are facing this now.
Thank you very much, Archie. Did anyone else want to add to that one? Sorry, before we move on. Andrea?
So I'm just starting up my own consultancy, and in the last week I've been looking for insurance, and I knew it was going to be difficult, but it's been really interesting. It's now almost too difficult for me to set up a consultancy, and I've spent 20 years obtaining a lot of qualifications and background. I oversee the fire risk register for the IFE. I have accreditations. I'm third-party accredited for fire risk assessment. I've got a master's degree in fire engineering. I consider myself competent to do the work that I want to do. But not only is it very hard for me to get insurance, it seems, of any type, but actually the exclusions that are being put on that insurance, particularly with the Fire Safety Act clarifications that are coming in a couple of weeks with regard to my fire risk assessments need to consider the structure and the external walls. I don't think I'll be able to do a suitable and sufficient fire risk assessment and comply with my potential insurance exclusions. Now, that's got to be an untenable situation for the industry. We simply can't go on like that. And when I've queried it with the insurance industry, they've said, well, there's a lag. We're not up to speed with that yet. Well, that's great. But what are we going to do? Are we going to be operating outside our exclusions, or are we not going to be working? I think we've, this is an issue that we really do have to address in the very near future.
That's great. Thank you very much. So moving on to our next question. So we did discuss about how we can affect the external envelope of the building. I know there's been quite a few fires, when there's a recent fire involving some of the external envelopes of buildings. How can we address this to make the building safer? I know, Luke, obviously you're involved in the like the balcony decking kind of side and refurbishment. What can we be doing to make these areas of the building safer on a fire aspect?
That's a big question, Kelly. It's a good question, and it's coming up more and more. There's obviously the guidance coming out recently about the facade or the specified attachments on facades mustn't spread fire regardless of height, but that is obviously their guidance note. And every project is different. Going back to the end of life or the full life cost of the building, it doesn't have to be an expensive option to go ahead and beyond of the compliance with the regulations and to be seen as a leader in safety and high-rise safety. I would just my advice would be to reach out to those within the industry, those to manufacturers especially, who may have insights in a huge number of projects, and ask for advice. If we don't have the answers or we can't provide the service, we have so many contacts of who may be able to help. So my advice would be to reach out.
Thank you. Nick, would you have anything to add to that from the Balcon perspective?
It was a sort of interesting comment on the chat about the value engineering and the nature of it, and flagging out the cost savings. And I go back to the same point again I made earlier, really. But cost avoidance can save a lot more money than trying to look at negotiation at this stage of placing an order, especially right now. Luke, you probably find it, Craig, Carson, anyone who's in manufacturing at the moment, there's massive shortages of materials. With that, the material pricing and availability of it is shooting through the roof as well. So it is a difficult thing as a manufacturer right now, but there's a lot more which can be done to actually remove cost at an earlier stage, and you ever save by going out to tender 3 or 4 times as opposed to once.
Great, thank you. On design stage, also we had a question earlier about there's a lot of demand at the moment for making buildings more environmentally friendly. How do we balance that out with actually ensuring that they're still fire safe when we're looking at other materials, trying to make sure that they're more carbon neutral? So Andrew, I know you mentioned something briefly about that, I think in your interview. How do we get that kind of balance between trying to be carbon neutral but also staying fire safe?
Yeah, I mean, I've spent many years now having an interest in timber because my first degree was actually based around wood science. So I'd like to think that I've got quite a good understanding of timber, and we're now, you know, looking at timber in a much more positive way for different reasons. But for me, the green credentials are somewhat more complicated than perhaps some groups are making it. I don't accept that just because something is timber, it's green, and just because something is concrete, it's not green. You know, you can get a much more environmentally friendly concrete, and at the end of the day, concrete is non-combustible. And you know, I'm looking at resilience of buildings, particularly multi-occupancy buildings. So for me, you know, if people want to have independent dwellings, private houses built of timber, then I understand that, and I understand the benefits in terms of you know, the materials are renewable, and the speed and the cost. But for me, in terms of multi-occupancy dwellings, it's got to be non-combustible construction. To do otherwise, I just don't have sufficient faith in the protection measures such as the plasterboard, when so many different groups, so many different families have the potential to have a huge impact on everybody else in that block.
Thank you. Tom, do you want to add to that one as well?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Andrew's comments. It's an interesting one. We spoke earlier about British standards and linking up with other groups to make sure they're not impacting. There's a lot of studies about timber frame buildings and buildings with timber on them that helps decrease the amount of carbon dioxide. So actually, you might find a big climate change group was saying, actually, we want as many timber buildings as possible. We in the fire side would say, well, actually, you're increasing the risk to life safety. But actually, you are doing a damage to climate change. So there's an awful lot of joined up thinking here. But again, it's provided you are providing safe housing, the routes that we take are kind of down to us and the expertise of the consultants. But it's a tricky one. But I kind of wanted to make the point, actually, that if we jump outside of construction and fire and we talk about climate, there's an awful lot of benefits of having timber frame buildings.
That's great, thank you. I say, so we are heading towards the end of the event. So if we could just ask the panel if we can get like a closing statement for everyone. So just if you had one piece of take home advice for those watching today, what would that be? So it's no particular order. I'm just going to go around how you are on my screen. So Tom, if you'd like to start, what would you give advice would you give to the audience?
It's an interesting one. I mean, I'd go back to the sort of the main talking point of competence, identifying if you need someone's assistance, asking why that actual individual is competent in what they're doing, and not relying on a badge of a company or a particular certificate of attendance or however many post-normals they've got. Have a discussion with them. They should be able to talk through your project and to give you some understanding, and show a bit of passion for it as well. Are they interested in the work they're doing and your particular project? But yeah, proving competence and pushing back. So yeah, that's probably my take home.
Thank you. Carlson?
Yeah, I suppose my take home would be to read the draft of the new Treble 91. It's fascinating. There are a huge amount of changes coming through, some which will be absolutely significant in changing the way buildings are designed and the systems that need to go in them and the components within that. I'm pleasantly surprised at how many positive changes there are, but I'd highly recommend people sign up to the BSI website, look at the draft. If you have bits that you don't understand or you think could be clearer, add comments to it, because it will help those drafting it to clarify those ambiguities before it actually comes out for public launch.
Thank you, Carlson. Nick?
I think it probably goes back to what we talked about at the end there, and creating balance, understanding what impacts decisions have on other areas, whether that's a fire decision and the environment, whether that's cost and fire, whatever that is, understanding what the consequences of certain choices are. I know Reza Builder bring out a book on that sort of topic fairly shortly with the 19 influences. That's one way of doing it, but certainly understanding that is really put a key part of competence in any role.
Great, thank you. Andrea?
I mean, I suppose the thing that I would emphasise is looking at your limitations as an individual, you know, as a fire safety professional. I think people need to have a little think about, you know, what they can do, what they can't do, perhaps ask somebody else their opinion on that, and also then, you know, actually have a plan for their CPD, so their continuing professional development. If you're a member of an institution, you'll be required to do CPD. And what I would really like to see is people having a structured plan. So, you know what I know what I don't know, and this is how I'm going to bridge that gap. And that's the point at which, you know, I would be much more comfortable, you know, working with people who can articulate that.
Great, thank you, Andrew. Craig?
Yeah, very good question. One key takeaway, but I guess one of the messages that's really coming through is start changing. Our change is ahead, and change has already begun. So start taking a deep look at what we're doing, and as Andrea says, what we do know and what we don't know, and start researching and reaching out to others, and being prepared to do something different, I guess.
So that's great. Luke?
Thanks, Kelly. Well, I guess around my takeaway would be around the new build side. The legislation is quite clear. A2S 1D0. There's a new legislation document out, or relatively new. Most would be aware of the BS 8579, which is the new balcony standard. But one thing I would ask is we're working on a huge amount of refurbishment projects and recladding projects and projects going through the Building Safety Fund. As many would know, aluminium decking isn't covered by the Building Safety Fund. So what we're finding is at very short notice, we're asked to supply aluminium decking for large projects. With the supply and demand at the moment and the volume of projects we're working on, we would just ask to reach out as early as you can. If people know they've got stock to remediate, they keep us in the loop, and the programme. We keep in touch with the fire assessors, the cost consultants, keep everyone in the loop and keep the communication going, so we can achieve our mission of achieving safety for the high-rise apartment community. That'd be my takeaway.
Thank you very much, Luke. John, would you like to give yours?
Yes, I think when selecting a sprinkler company, you just need to look at certification, competence, and as Lucas said, keep the communication going as well. All too often, we'll get a tender, we send in our tender document with the spec and everything, and the next we hear of it is there's a purchase order and about to start on site. So goodness knows what's happened between that original sort of specification coming out and the stage at which we're going into the installation. You know, I keep going on about fire strategy. That's a document that often changes through the project, and we've probably quoted on the very first one done by the architects. You know, so yeah, competence or an experience as well. You've got a lot of sprinkler companies, which is great. They're getting their third-party certification, but they don't realize their limitations when it comes to high-risk projects because they've lack of experience as well. So certification, competence, and experience and communication. There you go.
Thank you very much, John. And Howard.
Thank you. I don't disagree with any of those points, but I'm going to go big picture, if I may. I think that one of the I was thinking, what do we know? We know that the government has committed to implementing all of the recommendations that Dame Judith Hackett made in her review. And there are a huge number of them, and they are significant. We're seeing already, as others have mentioned, new standards being developed, whether they be PAS or whether they be full BSI or BS documents. We're seeing new legislation being introduced through the Fire Safety Act, the Building Safety Bill. We know that there will be secondary legislation supporting the Fire Safety Act in order to bring forward some of those recommendations that Hackett has made. And from my perspective, I think that there's a lot to focus on separately, as so many of the questions we've discussed this afternoon have touched upon, whether that be competency or the use of materials or communication or effective consultation and those sorts of things. But at the same time, I think it would be easy for organisations to sit back and say, I'm going to wait to be told what I need to do. But I think Hackett makes it reasonably clear what you need to do. And if you're not already planning for those changes and already actively involved in making changes across whatever part of the industry you work in, then you're probably going to find yourself left behind because, as I said, the changes are going to be huge and they are going to be significant. So really, in terms of an action, I think that if you're not already, engage with an organisation that will send you regular updates, whether that be joining the Institution of Fire Engineers, becoming a member of the FPA, or signing up for our newsletter, or any of the other organisations that we could mention. But make sure you're keeping up to date. Make sure you're keeping up with the changes. And it may seem like a bit of a task to, plough your way through the draft Building Safety Bill, but it doesn't take long to scan it and get a good understanding of exactly what's going to change. Similarly, looking at just the recommendations that Hackett has made rather than all of the detail behind it will give you a really good understanding, I think, of what's coming forward. And make sure you're moving with the times. Don't get left behind, really.
Great, thank you. And last but by no means least, Archie, what do you have for us?
Yeah, most of the points have been made, but one I will just reiterate is about PI insurance. If you're in the industry, you need to be lobbying all the groups like the FIA and IFE. You need to be lobbying MPs, because if you can't get PI insurance, you won't be working, or you'll be working without it, which is even worse. So I would recommend it. I mean, Andrea says it all about that. When you're competent and got lots of qualifications and you can't get PI insurance, it's wrong. So the only way that will change is if everybody in the industry, and there's a lot of people on this webinar, lobbies their MP or lobbies their associations to get it changed.
That's great, thank you. On that, Archie, we do have a recommendation, Andrea, for you for someone for insurance, so I will pass that on. So thank you to the viewer that's actually sent that in. So hopefully we might be able to help Andrea out with that. So yeah, again, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today. Great turnout. We do have a poll running at the moment. Please do give us a bit of feedback if you can. We do appreciate that, so we can continue to improve our events. Thank you massively to the panel for sharing your experience and your knowledge today. We've already had a lot of feedback on the messages saying what an informative panel it was, and they've all really appreciated it. So thank you very much for your time. I'd just like to mention as well, we do have our next event is our first face-to-face event since COVID. So again, we're massively looking forward to actually meeting some people like you guys face-to-face. I think we've all missed that, so we'll be looking forward to that, and that's going to be hosted at the Shard in November. If anyone's interested, there is different ways of viewing it, but there will still be the virtual option, because obviously some people might not be able to attend or might still not be comfortable face to face, so we will be catering for all groups. So please do go on to ResiBuild and take a look at that. It is launching our new book. So we have had, we're developing a book at the moment. It's going to be launched there with lots of industry experts with lots of great advice. So please do take a look at that and find out more information. If you've any questions at all, do just send us a message to the ResiBuild email that you've been receiving your event information on. If you want CPDs and things like that as well, please do go on there. We do have other companies like Quellfires and Mydex and Carson's CPDs on there, so do go on and take a look at the different ones available, and you can book them there. But yes, thank you very much, everybody, and I hope you have a good week.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Cheerio, everyone.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye all.